Alright, in this tutorial we're going to cover 3 different types of attacks using Unity and Playmaker. Let's show you an example of what we're going to be doing. As you can see, we have a character who can already walk in the scene. We're going to create an attack that can swing the sword and destroy the enemies. So attack number 1, swinging left or different right. We also have the option to shoot a projectile. This would be more applicable if the character had a gun, but since he doesn't have a gun, I'm just using the same sprite swinging sword to show that the sprite would play if I had a shooting gun sprite, but in case you're interested in learning how to shoot a gun. So it'll create a projectile, and then option number 3, we're going to work on coding him so we can jump like Mario style on top of the enemy and the slime gets destroyed. So I have a bat that follows me, and I can shoot any different method, whether it's the projectile, the sword by itself, or jumping an enemy. So if I were to drop another enemy in the scene, I can jump at him this way, or if I drop another enemy in the scene, I can shoot him long range, or I can hit him with just the sword. So there's 3 different types of attacks we're going to be covering in this video. So let's get started on this. Let's pause out that one, close this out. And so I'm using Unity 5 again, but this should be the same steps for Unity 4. Some things might be slightly different, but most everything should be the same. Alright, so the first thing we want to do is we want to take our new sprites and put them in here. Or actually, the last thing we have in this video, if I press play, and the last video we covered, the character can walk left and right, he can jump, and we have our 3 different types of enemy movements. So the slime's moving, it pushes me around. This bat follows me wherever I go. If I get far enough away, he'll stop following me. And then the other bat randomly appears somewhere on the screen. In this case, he was underneath me, and then now he's over there. So we have 3 different types of, now he's up here, so he's randomly appearing on the screen, but that guy always follows. Alright, so we have 3 different types of enemy movements, so let's code in 3 different types of enemy attacks. So the first thing is, let's bring in some attack animation for our character sprite. So let's pull up the sprites. I'll pull up, let's say, the character attacking and attacking while falling. So I have 2 different swinging the sword motions. So I'll drag both of these in here and I'll drop it in the sprites folder. Oops, I already closed out the 2 bats. Alright, so we need to adjust these sprites now since they're in the sprite sheet mode. We got to cut these out. So I'm going to change the single to multiple so I can select multiple images. Go to since this is running 2048, I'm going to set this to 4096 and change compress to true color so it gets better quality. Press apply, and we can see that it jumped to 2560, which is less than 4096, so I know that I'm getting full resolution out of the sprite and it's not compressing it by max size. So now let's go to the sprite editor, and I'm going to slice this. You could do it automatically, but I'll do it by grid. I made this at the sprite 256 by 256, so it's sliced it, and you'll see it slices everything nice and evenly. Click apply, and we have our sprite sliced out. Alright, jump into attack falling, and again, same thing, multiple, edit sprite editor, same thing, 256, slices, apply it, close this. This doesn't reach 2048, so we're fine leaving that the max size, change this to true color, and apply. So now the sprites are built. Now we want to add them to our character. So I click the character sprite, I go over to animation, and I go over here to, and again, animation tab is available in the window over here under animation. We'll also be using animator. So I go over to idle, I can click and create a new clip, and I'm going to put this in the animations folder and call this attacking. Press save, and I'm going to go over to the attack animation, grab 0 to 9, drop them in here, change the sample from 60 frames per second to 30 so it plays at the speed that I had animated it at. I can press the play button and I can see what's happening, the swinging of the sword motion, and I can pause it and cancel the record option so it saves that. And then we'll do one more, create a new clip. Under animations, I'm going to call this falling attack. So when he's falling in the air, or he's basically jumping up and attacking. We'll save that. Again, the same thing. We'll close out this, open up attack falling, 0 through 6. Drop these in here, sample from 60 to 30. And if I wanted to play, I can see what's happening. He's falling in the air and swinging his sword. Stop editing from cancel record mode, and we should be good. So now we have our sprites pulled into the game. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create a hitbox for the sword when the sword swings. So I'm going to go over to the scene mode and zoom in and kind of take a look at where our character is. So our character is sitting right here. Here's his collision for when he gets hit. So let's click off of that. I'm going to make under the hierarchy tab, create empty, which is also under game object, create empty. And it creates an empty object, kind of drops it anywhere in the middle of the screen. So we have our game object, which I'm going to call the sword hitbox. And I'm going to add a component, physics 2D. I'm going to add a circle collider on there, and then kind of move this somewhere on the player. It doesn't really matter where it goes, but you can kind of gauge how big does this need to be. In order to kind of gauge a little better, we can go over to the animator tab, and idle is the normal, where he's like idling and breathing, standing still. I'm going to go and change the attacking, right click, and set as default state. And this means as soon as the game starts, he'll be constantly attacking, which is not what we want to do, but for temporary purposes, we can check our collision. So if I press play now, he'll be going through the attack cycle non-stop. So now if I go over to the sword hitbox, I can kind of gauge, actually I can't push it through him because the collision box is collision and it's moving our character around by doing so. So if I click the is trigger option, now I have the ability to move this because as a trigger, it's no longer acting as a collision object. And I can kind of gauge and make sure the size of the circle looks like it's the same arcing motion of his swing. And it looks like it's the same size, so that's probably good enough. We'll adjust this later also, so we don't have to perfect it just yet. But it looks like the radius of 0.5 is probably fine. And the transform position, we're going to create it on top of the character, so don't worry about that yet. So we'll pause that. So once we're happy with this, and it's called the sword hitbox, I'm going to drag this from the hierarchy tab into the project tab. By doing this, it'll create a prefab of the sword hitbox. By doing this, we can call this at any point, because the sword hitbox in here we don't actually need. So if I were to press delete, we don't have a sword hitbox just floating around the level. It gets created when he swings a sword, and in order for it to get created, it has to exist somewhere, and we don't want it existing in the scene necessarily, so we're going to put it in the project tab. And you can't create this sword hitbox inside the project folder. You have to go and create it from inside the scene, and then we can drag it into here and create the prefab. Also of note, we want to change the sword hitbox, and we want to tag it as a certain code that we're going to read later. So I'm going to go and add a tag, and again, I don't have a tag that I want to use. I have ground and reverse, but I'm going to add a tag, +, and I'm going to put this tag as, sword. Alright, so this will be the sword collision box. I could call it something else or modify it, but the sword works enough for the tag. So now I can go back to the sword hitbox, and now that I've created a tag, I can use the tag. So now the sword tag is attached to the sword hitbox, and we have a collider in there. We want that to be is trigger, so it doesn't push him around. It just is a trigger to cause something to happen. Alright, so once that's all set up now, we want to go to, actually let's go back to the animator and take the attacking off the default state. So we'll go to, actually we might want to leave that on there for now. Yeah, let's leave that on there for now. This way we can test it later. Alright, so let's go add component, Playmaker FSM. Actually, no, we don't want to add it to the sword hitbox. Click on the character first. So we're on the character, and we already have several Playmaker FSMs already on the character. So I can add another one. So whether it's down here, add component, or we go over here to movement and just click a new one. So I'm going to add a new one. So we have movement, we have jumping, and we have falling. So at any point, any of these three codes can run. So I want to also add an attacking code that at any point can run also. So we're going to add FSM to character. I'm going to call the FSM attacking, so I know which one of these are now. Then let's go to state 1, and we're going to start coding in our character. So state 1 is going to be, I guess, get key, so we know what key we're going to be using. And we'll type that in here for the code, get key. We'll do get key down. The difference is get key is it's going to store your result. We want to actually send an event by clicking it. And we're going to have multiple different events for whether you're using the attack button or the shooting a projectile, or different types of attacks might hit different buttons. So we need to have different send events per key. And I'm going to use the spacebar for the attack button, but you can use any other button you want just by clicking and changing the key. And we'll go send event. We can't send an event because we don't have an event yet, so I'm going to call this sword attack. In this case, if I ever have a different attack down here, like shooting a projectile, which I'll do later, we can read a separate transition. So right click, add transition, and we'll do sword attack. Now we're going to change the send event from the spacebar when you press it to the sword attack, so it knows when you press space, send event sword attack, it goes to here, and we'll create a new state, so spacebar sends you to the next state. This state, now that we know the spacebar is pressed and we have a intent to make an attack action, we're also going to need to know which direction is going to be shooting or attacking or swinging a sword. So we have the direction state set up now, and so for this one we need to get scale. So we'll pull the get scale in here, and by doing the get scale we want to, I guess, basically say which direction he is, or figure out which direction he is. So I'm going to change the none, and again we don't have a variable to use for that, so I'm going to call this direction. So we have a direction float, go back to state, x scale, we'll call direction. So whether it's positive or negative, the number doesn't necessarily matter, but we'll know that what it is. And we don't need to do this every frame, it just has to occur once when he hits the attack button. So we have our direction, and now we're going to compare what the direction is. So we'll do compare, and I'll do a float compare. And we're doing float compare because we have a float variable as the direction. There's other compares also. So we're going to take the, for our compares, we want to use, we're going to compare, oops, scroll down, the direction with 0. So if the direction, which is this number, is his x scale, if his x scale is positive, meaning he's facing this direction, then he's obviously it's 0 or greater, so we're going to say it's greater than, and we need some event transitions in there. So I'm going to make some new events, and I'm going to call this one attack left, and a new one attack right. So I've made two different ones. You can call them whatever you want, but again, if he has a positive x, so his scale is positive, he must be facing to the right, so it's 0 or greater, so we're going to say he's attacking to the right. And now we're going to say, because we get the scale, and let's say he's facing left, then his scale is going to be negative because he's facing the negative direction. And if he's facing negative, then it must be less than 0, and if it's less than 0, he must be attacking to the left. Alright, and then this is giving us a warning that it's not used, and that's because it hasn't been applied here. So attack left and attack right. So now they're used here, so now it's not giving us that error message. And again, we don't need to do this every state. Once the spacebar is pressed, it'll automatically get the scale, figure out which direction it's facing, and compare it. So now that we've decided which direction he's facing, let's go make a new state. This will be, let's call this the flip left state. We'll add a new state, and this will be called the flip right state. So if he's attacking to the left, he'll go here, and if he's attacking to the right, he'll go here. Alright, so now that we have these set up, we need to create what the attack basically is at this point. So we have the send event sword attack when you press spacebar, figure out which direction he is. So now we need to, we're going to create an object at this point. So I'm going to drop create object in here, and the object we're going to create is the sword hitbox that we dropped in the prefab list. So we're going to go create object, we're going to pick the game object, and we're going to say create the sword hitbox. So I'm going to double click on that, it pops it in here. And the spawn point, we want that to spawn on the character. I haven't made a prefab for the character yet, but if you did, he'd be dropped in here, so I'm going to grab him from the scene. Eventually he'll have to be converted to be a prefab when you want to change levels, but for right now I'm still running him with being in the scene. So we've got the character, so wherever the character is in the scene, the sword prefab will get created right on top of him. Unfortunately, when he moves, the sword prefab won't move with him, so we're going to have to code that so it moves with him. That way the sword swing stays with him, especially in the case of him falling. When the sword is still hanging out and he's dropping, it'll still have collision on it. Otherwise, you'll only have collision up here, or when he's falling away from it. So we're going to do sword hitbox character, and we can specify an exact position right here by clicking on the position link, and so we'll know where to get that created at. So right now we're going to go press play. And at the moment he's on the flip left state, so I should probably have adjusted this first. Let's pause that. Let's put this on the flip right state because I haven't flipped him to the left yet. So again, create object, same thing, sword hitbox, a spawn point with the character. Alright, so on the flip right, since he's facing right at this point. Alright, we're going to press the spacebar, and it should create the sword hitbox. Actually, we haven't, yeah, sword hitbox should be creating, where did it go? Okay, never mind, it is popping in. I just didn't notice it. So if we press play again, we press the spacebar to attack, it is popping in, it's just an invisible collision box, so it popped in right here, so that wasn't here before. So I click on this, I can see that it did pop in. Alright, so if I were to press play and pause this, the invisible box disappears, and if you look down here when I press play, it's not existing yet, but as soon as I press play and I press the spacebar button, spacebar creates it. So it is here, we just didn't see it. Alright, so I click on this thing, and we can see where the collision is. It's appearing on top of the character, but it's not appearing in the right location. So don't move the character. If you were to move the character, you can see he's going to walk away from the collision box, and now we're not going to get this centered very well. So let's change that, pause this again. And because I left the animation constantly in sword attack mode, I can figure out where this needs to go. So I press attack, grab the sword hitbox, and figure out, let's say, move this up some here, move it over here. So it kind of matches the sword arc swing. So you can see wherever it's hitting, it hits that same arc radius. Alright, so once I like the numbers, let's round this off and say 1.2 by 1.3. So those numbers seem to work pretty well. It seems to have a nice sword arc radius. So 0.12 and I wonder if I can change this any smaller. Alright, so 0.1 and 1.1. Those are easier to remember numbers. So we have 0.1 and 1.1. So now when I unpause this, these numbers will get erased and the sword box won't exist anymore. It's just a temporary in the scene moment. So yeah, it got erased. So it was 0.1 and 1.1. So now that we know that, we'll go to the character, and now we're going to say it needs to be created at 0.1 and 1.1. And this is, oops, that was for the left one. This should be 0.1 and 1.1. Alright, so let's try this again. So I press play. So now that we've preset the position for this, when I press the attack button and then click on the box, we can see that it's getting created a lot higher, and the reason for this is that it's set to be a trigger. So if we try and move this, it's not moving the character. So it is a trigger, but it's getting created a lot higher than we need. So it's creating at 0.8, and we need to adjust this, so we want this to be 1.1. So the difference between 0.8, which is almost 0.9, and 1.1 is about a 0.3 difference. So if I pause this, what we actually want to do is change this to 0.3 increase. So if the character was actually centered more in the grid, so if I click on the character himself, so the character already has a 1.01 increase, so because he's already 1 unit higher, when I create it at 1 unit higher here, it puts it above him. Had he been created on the origin, it would have matched up better. But it tends to be a little bit off, I guess. So if you adjust it to figure out where it's going to occur at, eventually when you get to the point that when you press play and you attack, his hitbox should get created at the right place. And that's based on figuring out where these numbers are. So we know that it gets created essentially where it should be. Now when you move, it's not going to follow you. So we need to code that to occur so it follows you. So we'll go back to the character, and we have flipped right. So let's do a flip left as well. But before we do that, let's go to store object. We want to store this object. So what happens is the object doesn't exist in the scene. It exists in the project folder. It's going to get created in the scene. In order to call it later, to destroy it so it doesn't stay on the screen forever, we need to name it something because it doesn't exist yet. So once it gets created, we're going to put a name for it right here by storing the object. So I'm going to make a variable. I'm going to call this sword hitbox. Oops, and it's not a float, it's going to be a game object. So we don't need to define what game object it is because the state, the code is already telling it what it is. It just needs a name to store it. So since it's getting created, we're going to store it with this name as the sword hitbox. And this way we can do something about it later. Alright, so we're also going to do the same thing here. We're going to store this as a sword hitbox, and we're going to calculate which direction it needs to be in the other direction. So if he's standing in the right direction and we're getting a 0.1, 0.3, it should be negative 0.1 because it'll be facing the other direction, and 0.3 should be the same. It doesn't need to be negative because it's still going to be the same height. So if I were to press play now and turn him to the other direction and press the attack button and take a look at it, it should match the same arc again because we've reversed the positive and negative. Just like he flips with the positive and negative, the code will also flip the attack collision for us. So we have the same two different types of collisions. One's just positive and negative by switching it there with the X's. Alright, so now once we've created the attack, we need to add a new state. And this state we're going to call the attack. So everything else so far has been setting it up. We've been figuring out, you press the key to attack, which direction is it facing. Okay, draw the hitbox in that corresponding direction. We're also going to need finished states. Oops, not sword attack. Right-click, delete transition, right-click, add transition, finished. I could use any name I wanted, but I'll use finished. So finished goes to here. So after it's split apart and created a hitbox in either facing direction, we're going to go to attack, and under attack we're going to go add in for the actions. We're going to need set parent, and this way the collision box moves with the character. So we're going to set parent, user owner is the character, and we're going to call up, and here we can call the sword hitbox, but it's going to parent the project one. It's not going to parent the one that's in the scene. So if you were to press attack, theoretically get multiple different hitboxes, and it's not going to parent the ones in the scene, which is what we need. And it doesn't exist in the scene at the moment, so we can't parent it because it doesn't exist. So that's why we made this variable. So we're going to not use the, I'll set that back to none. We're not going to use the bullet, we're going to use the variable option. So now we can pull up the sword hitbox. So in the previous state, it gets created, saved as sword hitbox. Now we can call it up again as the sword hitbox because it's existing as a game object variable. Alright, so once the parent has been set, so at this point, if I press play, whichever direction he's facing, if I attack him, the sword hitbox gets created, and actually it doesn't move yet. Let's finish the code before we keep going any further. So we have the user owner parent is okay, set none. Switch this back out. The game object is the character, so scratch that. Alright, so the parent is the game owner. We're going to do something else with the sword later. So we have this, wherever he is, it gets created. I take a look at it, and it moves with the character. Actually, it still doesn't move with the character. Okay, we got that backwards. We have to specify the game object here's where it goes. And again, we can't pull it up there. We pull it up from the variable list. All right, now I've got it in the right order. All right, so the game object we're going to specify as the sort hitbox. So this object that we're using, sort hitbox, is parented to the character. Press play now. And so he moves left and right. He's still attacking all the time. We'll adjust that later. So we press spacebar for him to attack, and you can see the sword hitbox has gotten created. So wherever he is, again, it mirrors it when you flip left and right. So it gets created. So as long as he's in this position, which will always be in this position because that's the default position, once I jump out, it reverts the animation back. But if I press spacebar, nothing happens. We haven't done the animator code yet. All right, so the attack button, again, the game object, we're going to parent the character to the sword hitbox to the character. So once we have that done, we need to go and set some animator triggers. So let's go and create set animator trigger, and this will be the attack swing, and we're going to set another animator. We're going to use the set animator bool. Alright, so I'll move the boolean underneath the trigger. Alright, so we have the set parent. We're going to set the animator trigger. I'm going to call the trigger, I guess attack would be fine. And I'm going to set the boolean variable floating to being false. And I'll explain this when we get to it. But it fixes the problem with him being in the air. And one more thing, we're going to put a wait on here. So wait, and this is how long your attack animation is. So let's say mine's about 1/4 of a second, and the finish event will go to finished, and we need to reveal finished right here. So this way he has time to play the animation before it jumps to the next state. All right, and the next state would be, actually, we'll skip that for now. Let's finish the animator part. So animator, so now this is no longer going to be the default state. Idle is going to be the default state. We no longer need to check the hitbox. All right, so idle is the default state. Now we're going to say, from any state at any point, you can press the attack button. So we're going to move the attack up to here and click, right-click, make transition to attacking. So from any state, he can start attacking. What determines when you're allowed to do this? That's when we have the attack button. So we're going to make a new parameter, and we're going to make this one a trigger, and we're going to call the trigger attack. So when the trigger attack has occurred, we've already added that into the code. We're going to add a list, or add a condition, the attack condition. So when the attack trigger has occurred, as we mentioned in the code here, from any point in the game, whether you're jumping or landing or anything, it'll take you to the attack position. I'm going to change my settings and get rid of the transition duration, put that back to 0, and that should fix any potential glitches in there. And then from attacking, we need to go set this to basically when he finishes the attack. So I'm going to slide this over to this side and say when he finishes the attack, make transition. Let's put him back in the idle position when he finishes the attack. And what determines when he goes back to the idle position is basically the exit time. So when he exits, when he finishes swinging, he'll go back. And then we probably want to get rid of the transition duration again, but I'll test it and see what it looks like without taking that off yet. All right, so, and then one more thing, we want to make sure we have the attack falling set as well. So at any point, he could be attacking. What determines if he's going to do the attack falling animation? Let's pull this over here. So at any point, he can go and attack. I'll slide this up higher, put this down here. It's going to get a little messy. Make transition here. And this will be on the conditions list. We need to set that when the attack trigger is pressed, we want to make sure that it occurs, but we also want to make sure that he's on the ground or not on the ground, because both of these are true now. So whether his attack in the air or not. So we need to add one more condition. This one's going to be based on our other variable, grounded. If grounded is true, and the attack button's been pressed, then he must be on the ground attacking, then revert back to walking or standing. This one says when the attack button has been pressed and he's grounded as false, so he's not on the ground, then he must be floating when he's doing that. And if he's floating, then we probably want to let's put this over here. It's getting a little crowded. Alright, so the attacking, make transition, go back to the floating state afterwards. So you attack, go back to floating. And the difference is, or what we did over here, when we added on the floating is set to false, the problem is when floating, over here, this one. All right. So from any state, floating, if he falls off the edge, can become true. So if floating becomes true, because we coded when he falls off an edge, it's true. So we're going to set it to false so that it doesn't create another loop in order. Otherwise, it would play the floating animation and it would bypass the attacking animation. So by saying that floating is false, it allows us to play the attacking animation. Anyway, so back to here. So now that should work. We need to finish up the cycle right here. So we'll take send the finished over to here. And this is going to be the stop attack. And we're going to add an event on here, which is destroy object. And again, because we named it, we can actually destroy it in the scene. So I'm going to click on the sort hitbox from our variable list because we saved it as sort hitbox, and it'll destroy the sort hitbox. And then go to finished and restart back. Oops, not direction. Restart back at the original position. So I'll slide that over there. All right, and keep these a little more organized. Put them over there. All right, so all this should create the attack. When the attack finishes, it'll have a 1/4 of a second, which is the wait time, 1/4 of a second to finish before it destroys the hitbox and goes back to there. All right, so he swings his sword, and let's put this in scene mode. As you can see, he swings his sword, and the hitbox is temporarily there on the screen. If he flips direction, it's temporarily in there. And if he slides while he's moving, you can see that the sword hitbox follows him wherever he goes. And if he's in the air now, let's zoom out a little. Oops, jump. You can see the sword hitbox gets created. We may need to create a different hitbox because it's not quite the same shape. So we might have to adjust this later if we wanted to be a little more accurate. I'm just going to leave that for now, but you'd call up a separate hitbox depending on if he's in the air or if he's not in the air. So you press the key and you divide this whole section and say, if he's in the air, then do this. If he's not in the air, then do that. So, and you'd have two different hitboxes. And basically the same pattern, just copy and paste this whole thing and just split one more option. Is he in the air or not in the air? And copy and paste that. All right, so we have this. And the character can attack left and right. He has his collision, and the collision has a sword hit. And so eventually, we're going to do projectile now, but then we'll code in a little bit, in a few minutes or so, what we do with this collision box when the collision hits the enemy. So now that we have the sword swinging with collision on there, let's do a projectile real quick. So we take, most of this is all going to be the same. So let's go and create the get key, and we're going to say action browser. No, actually I just copy and paste, Control C, Control V, paste it, and change the spacebar to, let's say, the left shift should work. So I press the shift button on the left side, and that'll work. And in order to jump through the menu, like pressing up and down, that doesn't work. You press the letter of what you're looking for, and that'll jump to it. All right, so this one's going to be called projectile, which I don't have a transition event for. So I'm going to make a projectile and jump back over here and call this projectile. So if you press the, and I need to reveal that, add transition projectile. All right, so when you press the spacebar, it goes to regular attack. When you press the left shift, it'll go to projectile mode. And projectile mode, we're going to basically copy and paste pretty much most of this. So I'll take these, the direction, the flip left, and the attack. Let's see if I can make some more room. Alright, so Control C, Control V, and I now have a whole new group. Alright, so this group right here, we'll take the projectile over here, and we'll have direction. So we get the same effect. Which direction is he facing, left or right? And then we're going to say which, if he's facing left or right, we're going to create an object. But in this case, instead of creating the hitbox, we're going to go and create a projectile object. And I don't have a projectile object yet, so I'm going to go make one real quick. In order to do that, I'm going to go create empty. I have an empty right here. I'm going to attach, add component, rendering, sprite renderer, and I'm going to pick the sprite I want to use. I don't have a bullet sprite, so I'm just going to grab I could grab, I guess, a random object. I'm going to go import something real quick. Or not. I don't have that right now. So pull up 1 through 5. All the different sprites I have. Alright, so slime burst, if I were to grab all of these, drop these into this folder, actually drop these into Unity, so let's pull up Unity. Alright, so this is the slime burst. We'll cover this part later when he gets burst, but I'm going to use one of these burst positions as a bullet for now, just because it'd be interesting, since I don't have a bullet. Alright, so I have this. Let's go find our game object, which I'm going to call the projectile. We're going to go add the sprite. Now that I have the slime burst, I can use that as the bullet. That'll work just fine. Alright, so that's our bullet. Actually, I could change that to a different, that one would be interesting, or that one for a bullet. We'll do that one. Alright, so we've got a blue flying object. Alright, so that's our object. We need one more thing. We need circle collider. I'm going to change the radius size to something about like there, maybe 0.24. Alright, so that's my collision radius for this. And this is a trigger as well. We don't want to actually have this bumping into objects. We just wanted to trigger things to occur. Alright, so this is our projectile, and we need to name this. I'm going to name this tag with a, I guess a sword, because the sword kind of denotes that it's being hit by something. So I'm going to use the sword as the attack variable. So now that I've created this, I'm going to drop this in the prefab list so I can call upon it later. And then I don't need it in the scene anymore, so I can delete that out. So now I have a projectile with all the settings on there. And I can create multiple of these. So let's pull up the character now. And now that we have the object, we'll create the game object. And this is the projectile that we have as the prefab. So I'll take the projectile prefab, and we're going to create the spawn point same as the character, and probably the same position as well. Since I copied it, might as well go in the same position. And we're going to store this object as a, let's make a new variable, projectile shot, and save this as a game object. Alright, add that to the scene, and now we're going to go use that as the projectile shot. So it's going to create the projectile based on what's in the prefab list. It's going to spawn it at the character's origin point, and so wherever he's in the scene, and it's going to save that object that got created as a name called projectile shot, so I can call it and delete it later. Alright, and then repeat the same thing. Again, it's going to create the same object. We're going to add the projectile, spawn point character, same location, store it as a projectile shot, and then over here in the attack section, we don't need the parent because we don't need the object following the character, so we can delete this option. We want to use the set trigger because we want to play the attack animation. If you had a different animation, you'd code it differently in the animator, but I'm just going to reuse the same attack sequence. And then floating again to help fix the glitch when he's in the air. And then The wait time, we don't necessarily need a wait time because once he shoots it off, then if you leave the wait time, then he has a reload time basically for the gun. So if you wanted to leave that or not, you can. Alright, but you also, I guess, need the wait time for the finished option to send it back. So when it's finished, let's put this down. Oops, move this down here a little bit. And then I can grab this and drag the finished back up to here so it can restart. Make that a little more organized. Alright, so a little more organized. It's kind of a lot of stuff there. Alright, so this attack, so we have this, we also need to adjust, so we have the animations being triggered, but we need to make what we're going to do with the projectile. So the projectile gets created back on either of these. It gets create object, it spawns it, but it doesn't actually start moving it. So it's just going to create an object that sits on our screen. So we need to set the velocity so it starts moving it. So set velocity, and we can't do it here because it doesn't exist. We could put it on the projectile itself, but I can also code it right here. And we can't put it on the projectile itself because it doesn't know would it be going left or right. So I'm going to put set velocity on here. We're going to use specified game object, so we're not going to use the characters. We're going to use we're not going to use that either. We're going to use projectile shot. So specify the game object, so we don't need to put that rigid body on there because it's a projectile shot. It's grabbing the object, and we're going to put the X as 2. So it has a velocity of 2. And this is how fast your bullet's going to start moving. You don't need to do every frame, it's just going to create it. Alright, so we have so the animation is playing, we have the wait time on there, we have the velocity, and then afterwards it goes back to here. So if I were to press play now, if I press the shift button, it creates this, and actually it hasn't set to move yet. Alright, so let's go and check this again. Alright, so let's actually take the velocity off here. So I'm going to control X to remove it. I'm going to put it on here. So control V, paste it. So the set velocity 2, since this is a positive number, so when he attacks, this way he'll know it goes in the positive 2 direction. And I'm going to paste it also right here. And this will be negative 2, so it goes in the negative direction, so we know which direction it starts moving. Alright, so, and again, we don't have this, actually we do have this game object specified, so it should start moving, unless I'm missing another piece of code. Alright, so you press shift, and it's not moving yet. Oh, so, okay, so that's the problem. We have the wrong velocity. I used set velocity, which is a 3D object. This is set velocity 2D, so the velocity isn't working. So we need to delete that. Oops. Delete that one. Set velocity 2D. Alright, so create the game object, then set velocity after it gets created. We're going to use the owner for specified game object, and projectile shot that got created. X is going to be negative 2 because it's going in the left direction, and it's negative. Alright, so that should work there. Let's copy this, Control C, and delete out this one. It's the wrong one. Paste it. So set velocity 2D, and now it should work. Looks like it didn't save all that. Projectile shot X is positive 2. Alright, so that should set our velocity. And one more thing, when the projectile gets created, it's going to need add component, physics 2D, a rigid body on there. And we want the gravity set to 0, otherwise the bullet's going to fall towards the ground. We kind of want the bullet to fly straight the entire time. So I'm going to set a no gravity on it. So now that it has a rigid body, now it can actually calculate the set velocity 2D. So if we go back to here, we have the character, with projectile being shot with set velocity 2D. We'll press play. Alright, now he shoots. The problem is that bullet's going to go on forever and eventually take up a lot of game resources if you shoot a lot of bullets, because there's nothing to destroy the bullet. So we need to destroy that bullet. So on the projectile, I'm going to add a component, Playmaker, FSM, and this will be bullet time, state. For the bullet time, we need to check, I guess, wait. Add transition finished, add state, call projectile. Alright, so the finish goes to destroy projectile. The destroy projectile needs a destroy self, and the wait time, we need wait on there. Wait to destroy it. This is how long you want it to stay on the screen. So if I say 2 seconds, go to finished. So when the bullet gets created, it'll wait for 2 seconds and then it'll destroy itself. So if I press play now, let's zoom in a bit. If I press shift to fire it, it stays on the screen for 2 seconds, and no matter how many I fire, they'll disappear in 2 seconds, which at the rate on the screen, it's off the screen, so 2 seconds is perfectly fine. So wherever he moves and fires shots in any direction, 2 seconds, by the time 2 seconds occurs, he'll already be, it'll be off the screen, so we're perfect on that timing. Alright, so now that we have the projectile working and the sword swinging working, let's start coding in how the enemies are going to start getting hurt. So let's go over to the bats. I'll start with this bat, and we have flying on here, so we'll add a new code so we don't interrupt the flying. So at any point he's flying, he could get hurt. So I'm going to call this one, actually let's call it FSM, let's name that one collision, or you could say bat hurt or something. Alright, so collision is the first state. On the first state, we want to have a event. We're going to call it hit sword, or hits, I guess, hit sword. We're going to reveal the transition, hit swords, and then one more. Destroy. So over here, oops. Alright, we're going to go destroy self. Actually, that goes on destroy. So destroy self on collision with, and now we're going to detect a collision. So trigger 2D event. So this is a physics 2D option. So trigger 2D event. Since we're not looking for a collision, since the bat doesn't have collision and the bullet doesn't have collision, they're both triggers. So if I click back on the projectile is a trigger. It doesn't have pushing collision to it. So we jump back over to here with the bat flying. So collide tag, we're going to use the sword tag because the sword kind of denotes as being hit by a destroyable object. And we're going to go to hit sword. And we've already named the projectile as a sword, and the same thing with the sword hitbox is considered swords. So whether it hits, so if it hits the sword tag being the projectile or the sword hitbox, it should destroy the bat. So it hits the sword collide tag, sends event to hit sword, and destroys the object. So pretty much as simple as that. And again, if you have something that doesn't have a trigger and is set to natural, like the slime where it's a collidable object, you'd want to switch this out from trigger to collidable object, which is a collision 2D event. But I'm going to take both of these, I'm going to copy both of these, and I'm going to apply this to the other bat. So I'm going to make a new FSM. So yeah, I never named this one. This one's the direction. So I have the following and then the direction he's going. So let's add another one. This is going to be called the hit sword or whatever, or I can call it collision, I guess. Actually, yeah, so paste, Nope. Let's go back to this one, grab these again. Copy states, jump to this bat under the new FSM, which is collision, paste states, replace as the start, and I don't need that one. Alright, so now I have collision, which I can take out the 2. Alright, so collision with the sword, destroy this bat as well, and then we'll take this again one more time for this guy, and we'll say add FSM to the slime, and we'll paste states again, replace as start states, so I can delete state 1. So when the collision hits the sword, it'll again destroy the slime. So now we have it destroying all 3 of these whenever a collision or a tag titled sword hits any of these objects. Let's name this one. Alright, so that should work with that. So if I run over here, this bat will see me in range. I can swing the sword and the hitbox hits him. The same thing with the slime. If I run over here and the bat hits it, this one I'll shoot the projectile, and it looks like it's going at the same speed as the bat, so that won't help. Boom. So now I can take it out that way. So if I were to restart this level, try this again, I can jump over here. I can use the projectile to hit the bat. I can use the projectile to hit the slime, and I can use the sword collision box to hit the other bat. So the collision now destroys the bats. The sword swings and the projectile shoots. So let's code in one more thing. Alright, so the last thing to code in now, we're going to create a Mario style jump on the enemy and it destroys them. So we already have the other attack types, the swinging the sword and the projectiles coded in. So the last thing is landing on an enemy. It can be a little bit tricky with this part. So let's put in, I guess, so we'll go with the slime. So I'm going to put the jumping on the slime as the, I'm not going to worry about jumping in the bats. I'm going to put once on the slime. Alright, so over here we have the slime as movement and the slime as collision. So under the collision aspect, so we have collide with the sword and that'll destroy him. So we're going to add one more. So we want to make a new one in case the character lands on him. We're going to call this, I guess, jumped on. Or, yeah, or you can call it whatever you want. Actually, no, the FSM should be that. Or you can say hits player or collision with player. Alright, so collision with player is probably the best term because we have collision with sword. So I'm going to rename this one. Alright, so at any point this could occur. So whether you're colliding with the player, he's moving, or the sword will occur. So I'm going to go with collision with player. And the first state I'm not going to name as jumped on. I'm going to call this collision because we don't know what is occurring. So when he collides, we need to go and add a couple, I guess, or at least one transition. We're going to say hits player and reveal that under hits player. So the slime hits the player. We don't know if the player is landing on him or if the slime's bumping into him, but in either case he's hitting the player. So we have to determine if that event occurs first. And we're going to go over here and call this, actually, I was right, trigger 2D. So actually, if the slime was a trigger, in this case you can see that it's not checked. If he was a trigger, you'd be using trigger 2D event. But since he does have collision and we can push against him, he's going to be a collision 2D event, which is different than trigger 2D event. Alright, so he has collision on collision enter. We're going to say collide tag with player. Alright, so on collision event of the slime with the player tag, which is the player, send event to he hits the player. We don't need to store anything, so we're good with round 1. We're going to make a new state, and this state we're going to call test jump. So is the player jumping or not? So we're going to send this to the test jump. On this state, we're going to add actually, let's add one more thing to this one. So I'm going to copy this one, Control C, paste it, Control V, and collision enter. I'm going to call collision stay, and everything else will stay the same. What basically happens is if you enter the collision and the slime's pushing against you, he can constantly be pushing against you, but because he's never entering your collision a second time, he's still in the collision, then he'll never hurt you again. And so you're kind of invincible as long as you're still pushing against him. But in this case, if you're staying in his collision, so you push against him once, and as long as you stay against him, you're still triggering this event, so you can still get hurt both ways. So we need to add both in there to fix that. Alright, so test jump. We're going to go over here, and we're going to compare some velocity. So, not that. Put that back there. Compare velocity. Actually, it's going to be a float compare. So we'll take the float compare and we'll drop this in here. What we're going to be doing is basically comparing the velocity of the character's falling speed, basically, so it can determine if he has a falling speed, then he must be above the slime and hurting him. But in order to compare with the variables, we want to know what his velocity is. So if I click on the character right here, we have him under when he's falling, we have a velocity. So it already gets that velocity for us and is saving it as a y velocity. But when we go back to the slime and we try and use that variable, there is no variable for the slime that has a y velocity on there. The slime doesn't have it. The character has his own personal variable called y velocity. So if we want the slime to use the player's velocity to recognize it, we're going to make a global variable for that purpose. So we're going to go to global variables, and I'm going to make a new one on the. It doesn't matter if you make it on the character or on the slime. Either way, it'll work. So we'll go to. Let's call it. I guess player y. Y velocity. I guess that could work. An extra one there. So player y velocity, it kind of makes sense. And we'll call this a float value as well. So we'll add that to our globals, and then I'll go over to. And so now that we're going to swap out the y values, we have to go over to here where it's used. So we're using y velocity, but instead of using y velocity now, we're going to swap out and use player's y velocity. And we'll go down here to the next one. Global's player y velocity, and swap out all three of these. What's going to happen now is that it's still going to work the same as a jump. We have to get velocity 2D, and it's saving his y velocity in the global variable now instead of his personal variable. And it's going to do it every frame and absolute value that y velocity and overwrite it. And then it's going to compare, and that helps if he's falling off the edge. But now that we've defined it as a global variable and I jump back to the slime, I can go over here and pull up the global variables, whereas before he has none, but now he has the option to use a global because I have one global. And this is the player's y velocity. I guess I could shorten the name, just call it player y, but that's fine. So we're going to compare this to basically how fast do I want it to be falling to record it as a hit. So I'm going to say 4. 4 should work pretty well. And we're going to say, actually we can't do anything besides we can use hit player. I need to make another event. So we have one for hit player, and we're going to call another one. Let's call this jumped on. So we have add transition, we have hits player, and we have add transition jumped on. So we have two different options now. So going back to this, if the player's y velocity is less than 4, then you're probably going to hit the player because you're not actually, there's not enough dropping speed to indicate that he's probably falling on the slime. But if the player's y velocity is greater than 4, then he's probably falling pretty fast, which means he's trying to jump on the slime. So if it's greater than 4, we're going to go with jumped on. And you can change this, vary this. The 4 is going to determine how fast you need to be falling on there. And we could do it every frame. We don't have to do every frame, but I can leave it as an extra just in case. I'll drop this down here and pop a new state up here. I'm going to put this one and call this one, I guess, hurt player. So if he hits the player, we're going to hurt the player. And I'm not going to code the health in there right now. We're going to do it in the next tutorial. But we might as well send it to an event at this point. And so since I have this up here, I'm just going to do wait, and this will, putting a wait in here for like 1 second will enable the slime not to constantly keep hurting me. It gives me a second, or the character a second, to walk away from the slime instead of instantly draining your life, which we'll explain some more when we get to the health. But we'll do a wait in there, and then add transition finished. Once it's done, we'll go back to there. So if the player's velocity when he collides with the slime is not greater than 4, then he hits the player and goes back to here. But now if the player's velocity is greater than 4, let's go make a new state. So we'll add state, and I'll call this one, I could say he jumps. Here's where it gets a little tricky now. You could say, and simply be done at this point, is that if you jumped on the player, or he's jumped on, boom, destroy the slime and you're done. But you have two possible errors that could be a problem. One is saying if the player has velocity greater than 4, destroy the slime. So if you're jumping upwards and the slime is above you, basically you could headbutt him and destroy him, because you have a velocity greater than 4, guys, you're moving up and he's falling down. So if you don't want to headbutt, then we'll have to make an extra check. Also of note, if you're running at a fast pace and you slightly go over like an incline and you suddenly have a velocity, but basically you're still walking, it can register as a velocity change and thus destroy him just by walking into him. So we want to eliminate both of those potential glitches and say that the character has to physically be above the slime, not walking fast and slightly be elevated, but has to be actually above the slime and not under the slime. So if you wanted to headbutt this, you wouldn't necessarily need this step, but we're going to do this to get rid of that potential problem. So we're going to basically do a double check. So we're going to test the jump to make sure he has velocity, but now we're also going to test, is the player above? So I'll name that the player above state. And then I'll go over to, let's make a transition. I might as well just call it finished, I guess. Actually, no, not finished. Let's delete that transition. All right, so we're going to do basically the same thing. We're going to say he hits the player or he's jumped on. All right, so what happens is it's going to double test it again, and in the double test we're going to put, get position. We're going to get the position of the slime and the position of the character. We don't have any variables to drop in there yet besides a global, and we're not going to use that one, so we're going to make 2 more. So right now I have the global used 4 times, but let's pull up 2 more variables. I'm going to call this players y, and we're going to make a new one. So click here in the empty space and you can get a new one. And this will be called the slime y. So I have the players y and the slimes y. So I've created 2 float variables, so now I can test these together. So I'm going to store get position of the owner. The owner is the slime, so we're going to store the slimes y as that, and then I'll grab another get position, and I'm going to grab the specified game object and pull up from the scene the character. So I'm going to grab the character's y position and save that as the player's y. And this isn't going to be the y velocity because I'm not gauging how fast he's moving. This is just his position. Is he physically above or physically below, not what speed is he moving at. So player's y is different than player's y velocity, or velocity in general. All right, so we have those 2 positions on here. So next up we want to go and compare these 2. So we're going to, actually, one more thing to add. We're going to do a float subtract and drop this in here. What this will do, if you click on the slime, let's say his X is right here. If you click on the player, or not his X, but his origin point, I guess, right in the middle, it's only slightly above the slime. So if the player is, even if he's not slightly above, in some cases he can walk right into him, bump him, and destroy him because his Y is slightly higher than the slimes. So we're going to minus an amount from the player. So if I minus, and let's say we move it like 0.5 down, so his Y becomes down here, so now the player actually has to be a lot higher. He can't just be slightly a couple of pixels higher, he has to be half half a unit higher, which means that by moving the unit down, the player has to be moved up in order to correspond to a hit. And this kind of takes out the glitch where you can bump into him and only be partially on the ground. So now he has to be a little bit higher. So we're going to subtract 0.5 off of there, and we're going to subtract it from the player's Y. So the player's Y basically means, or you could basically add 0.5 to the slime to make him look taller. In either case, it kind of helps work that out. And we don't have to do this every frame, just do it once. Grab the slime's Y, grab the player's Y, minus 0.5 off the player's Y, and then we're going to compare. So putting all this in the same exact, in a certain order, it's going to grab them, subtract them, and then compare them. Float, compare. Boom. So we're going to compare now I guess we'll start with the player's Y and compare that to the slime's Y. So the player's Y now having 0.5 minus off of it, if it's still more than the slime's Y, we're going to go to saying he's jumped on. But if he's less than, we're going to hit player. So if the player, even with the minus 5, is still less than the slime's height, then hit the player because he's not high enough above the slime to count as a hit. And that's where we're going to go with hits player. So boom, we have one test to hit the player, second test to the player. Now we're going to say if he jumps on him and his speed, he has enough speed and he's physically above him, now we can destroy the slime. Jump over here, and we could call this destroy. But there's one more thing I want to add. Because I have animation on the slime, or I want to add animation for the burst effect, we're going to play the animation before we go and destroy the slime. Otherwise, you would just call this destroy object because you've basically destroyed it. But if you want to have some kind of animation effect on it, I'm going to call this the play burst. So I know it's playing the burst animation. And then we'll add one more add state. Actually, let's go to transition finished. We'll send finish to here. And this one's really easy, so let's do this first. Yeah, destroy. We'll go destroy self. Boom. So we're going to put a destroy self on this destroy state, and so it'll destroy the slime. So to play the animation and then destroy it. But in order to play the animation, we want to put up, I guess we need an animator trigger. Should have spelled that longer. Animator trigger. That's easier to find. Alright, set animator trigger. And I'm going to call the trigger burst. I haven't made it yet, but I'll just code it anyway. So we have a burst. And in order for the burst to finish playing before the slime gets destroyed, otherwise he'll count it as you hit the slime, boom, destroy it immediately. We don't get to see the animation because it runs too fast. So I'm going to add one more action on here, wait, and I'm going to put the wait at like 0.25, 0.2, and then finish event goes to finished. So now it'll play the burst animation and give the animation 0.2 seconds, 0.2 of a second to play long enough before it jumps to destroying the object, which will destroy the animation with it. Alright, so that should finish up the code for us. Now we just have to go and plug in the animator animations. So we've got the, so just a quick review. We've got the collision of the player. We're checking the collision. We're going to test whether the player's Y velocity is high enough. We're going to go test the player's position versus the slime's position. Then we're going to play the burst animation and destroy it. And if it's not, then we go and hit the player. Alright, so let's jump over to the animator. Actually, we need to go import the animation first, which I've already done. When I brought it in earlier, we have the 4 different animations. We have 6 different cycles. So whereas I had the sprite sheet as one big long sheet, and these are what I've been using. But in this case, I made separate images. So you can do separate images if you want. It keeps a little more organized if you have it as a long sprite sheet. So in this case, if you brought all these 6 in, we're going to get the 6 popping in here, and it takes up a little more space in the project folder because whereas this guy walking, it's all contained inside of this one sprite sheet. But now we have to have all these separate sprite sheets. So it's a little more space conservative to import a sprite sheet versus individuals, but you can do individuals. And then again, take all of these here, and then go over to the slime. You have to click on the slime in order to add animation to them. And I've already added the slime burst, but you would create a new clip and click slime burst, and then you drag these into here and it pops them in there. So that's why it's already in the animator tab. So over here, slime burst, and let's delete out the initial transition. So we're going to make a new transition. Make transition down to here, down to slime burst, and in order for the slime burst, if it's going to go from slime hopping to slime burst, and the only way he's going to go to the burst position is if he's triggered to do that. And I've already created a parameter. Clicking the plus button right here will pop a parameter in there. So once you create it, you can click trigger and then type it in. The name you use here, burst, has to be spelled the exact same way, uppercase, lowercase, whatever you use. The way you spell it here has to correspond exactly to the way it's been described here. So burst the same way it's spelled. And so we'll click back on the transition point, and it doesn't need to exit time. He doesn't need to finish hopping. As soon as he hits burst, as soon as he's been hit, just burst them. And settings right here, where it has this this blue transition period, delete that. That'll cause a delay. Unity 5 has the settings. Unity 4 doesn't have that. For some reason, it's not necessary, at least in the sprites. And then list is empty for the conditions. We'll add one, and the only one we have is the burst. So if burst is triggered, then play the burst animation. So everything should be set up now. So let's test this. And actually, let me get rid of this ground platform because it's kind of in the way trying to jump on the slime. So let me check that, which kind of like hides it. So it's still there. I'm just hiding it so it's not in the way at the moment. All right, so let's test that. So if I jump and land, boom, he's burst. So that's pretty much how this works. So this covers how to, should cover how to jump on the slime basically. So you can push him. He has collision. If we were to go and click on the slime over here, and then go back to here, you can see that, oops, let's set this back to collision with player. And so I can push him, so player is being recognized as being hurt all the time. And then you can see it's slightly lighting up green when I stand up. So that would otherwise be causing an issue, but the double check is preventing it from counting as a burst hit. Oops, I pushed him off. So we can just jump on the, let's play one more time. So in conclusion, so this tutorial we've covered how to jump on an enemy and have the slime burst. We've got an enemy following that we can destroy with a sword, and we also have the ability to shoot a projectile. Let's see if I can aim. Boom. Or not shoot fast enough. But yeah, so we have the ability to shoot out projectiles, and I can't shoot low enough. Maybe we can try it again. Boom. Alright, so we got the projectile, we've got the sword swing, and we have the ability to jump on enemies. So that more or less covers this, and in the next tutorial we're going to cover health.